Chapter 8, Unit 8, Argumentation. 8.1 Understand Argumentation. Let's start with something fundamental, something so basic that it's easy to overlook, but so important that getting it wrong will cost you points all over the AP exam. What exactly is an argument? Here's where most students make their first mistake. In everyday life, an argument means a disagreement. Two people fighting about who forgot to take out the trash. But in AP English Language and Composition, an argument is something far more purposeful. An argument is a reason-supported claim designed to convince an audience to accept a particular position or take a particular action. No yelling required. Think of it less like a kitchen argument and more like a lawyer standing before a jury, building a case piece by piece, evidence in hand with a specific goal in mind. That lawyer image, hold on to it. It will serve you all year. The core components of argument. Every argument, whether it's a presidential speech, a New York Times op-ed, or an essay you write on exam day, has the same skeleton. There's a claim, which is the central assertion the writer wants you to accept. There's evidence, the specific facts, examples, data, anecdotes, or expert opinions used to support that claim. And there's reasoning, which is the logical explanation of why the evidence actually supports the claim. College Board cares deeply about this third element, and you should too. A lot of student writing has claims and evidence but skips the reasoning. It just assumes the connection is obvious. It isn't. Spelling out the logical link between your evidence and your claim is what separates a 3 essay from a 5 essay on the FRQ. There's also the warrant, a term borrowed from philosopher Stephen Toulmin, whose model of argumentation is baked directly into the College Board framework. The warrant is the underlying assumption that makes the logical connection between evidence and claim possible. It's often unstated, which is exactly what makes it interesting and dangerous. When an author leaves a warrant implicit, they're gambling that the audience already shares that assumption. When you're analyzing arguments on the AP exam, one of your jobs is to identify and evaluate those hidden warrants. Ask yourself, what does this author assume the audience already believes? That question is golden. The rhetorical situation and argumentation. You cannot separate argumentation from rhetorical context. The College Board framework, often called SOAPs or the rhetorical situation, lives inside every argument you'll encounter. The speaker's identity, the occasion that prompted the argument, the audience being addressed, the purpose behind the argument, and the subject being discussed all shape how that argument is constructed. An argument written by a climate scientist for a congressional committee is built completely differently than one written by a teenager for a school newspaper, even if both argue for the same policy. On the multiple-choice section, you'll be asked to identify how these contextual factors influence specific rhetorical choices. Pay attention to how audience shapes argument. It's one of the most tested ideas in the entire course. Logos, ethos, and pathos in argumentation. The classical appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos, are the engines that power any argument, and here's a trap the exam loves to set. Students often treat these as separate categories that belong in separate paragraphs, when in reality, sophisticated arguments weave all three together. Logos is the appeal to logic and reason, statistics, cause and effect reasoning, analogies, definitions, factual evidence. Ethos is the appeal to credibility and character, credentials, first-hand experience, fairness, acknowledgement of complexity. Pathos is the appeal to emotion and values, vivid stories, emotionally resonant language, appeals to shared identity or fear or hope. The trap on MCQs is being asked to identify the primary appeal in a passage and choosing pathos simply because a story is present, or logos simply because numbers appear. Strong authors use data to create emotional impact and use stories to establish credibility. Always ask, what is this particular technique doing for the argument in context? Types of claims. College Board distinguishes between several types of claims, and being able to identify them matters both for analysis and for your own writing. A claim of fact asserts that something is true or false, that a particular event occurred, that a statistic is accurate, that a phenomenon exists. A claim of value argues that something is good or bad, moral or immoral, important or trivial. A claim of policy argues that something should be done, that a law should change, that an action should be taken. Many arguments layer all three. First establishing facts, then evaluating them, then proposing action. On the synthesis, FRQ especially, knowing what type of claim you're making shapes everything about how you structure your response. Acknowledging complexity, concession, and refutation. Here's something that surprises students every year. The strongest arguments don't ignore opposing viewpoints. They engage them. Concession is the move where a writer acknowledges that the other side has a point. Refutation is the move where the writer then dismantles that point or explains why their own argument prevails despite it. This 1-2 combination signals intellectual honesty and strengthens credibility enormously. When you see a phrase like admittedly, while it is true that, or critics may argue that's concession and something important always follows it, on the argument FRQ, incorporating concession and refutation is one of the clearest paths to earning that sophistication point on the rubric. Don't ignore the other side. Greet it, then defeat it. Common MCQ traps and misconceptions. Let's talk about the traps College Board loves. First, confusing the topic of an argument with the claim. The topic is what the argument is about. The claim is what the author asserts about it. Climate change is a topic. The federal government must implement a carbon tax by 2030 or risk irreversible ecological damage is a claim. Second, assuming that because evidence is emotional, it's only pathos. A personal story from a veteran arguing for healthcare reform does emotional work and provides first-hand testimony that builds ethos and supplies evidence for a logical case. Don't reduce complex rhetorical moves to a single label. Third, confusing an author's purpose with their claim. Purpose answers why they're arguing. Claim answers what they're arguing. These overlap but are not identical. Connections across units. Argumentation isn't isolated to Unit 8. It's the spine of the whole course. The rhetorical analysis skills from Units 1 through 3 give you the tools to dissect arguments. The evidence and commentary work from Units 4 and 5 builds the muscles you need to construct them. The synthesis skills of Unit 7 ask you to bring multiple arguments into conversation. When you understand argumentation deeply, every other unit clicks into place. With the foundations of argumentation firmly in hand, you're now ready to zoom in on the specific strategies writers use to build those arguments, which brings us to the fascinating world of rhetorical devices and their effects. 8.2 Understand classical argument structure. Let's talk about something that has been persuading people for over 2,000 years and will absolutely be tested on your AP exam. Classical argument structure isn't some dusty relic from ancient Greece. It's the backbone of every persuasive essay, every legal brief, every political speech you've ever encountered. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you can use it, you become genuinely dangerous on the AP language FRQ. The blueprint. What classical argument actually is. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. Imagine you're a lawyer walking into a courtroom. You don't just walk up to the jury and blurt out your opinion. You introduce yourself. You lay out your case. You present your evidence. You knock down the other side's claims, and you close with something unforgettable. That's exactly what classical argument does. It's a structured, 6-part architectural blueprint for persuasion that traces back to Aristotle and was formalized by Roman rhetoricians like Cicero and Quintilian. The College Board expects you to know every room in that building. The 6 components are the exordium, narration, partition, confirmation, refutation, and peroration. Let's walk through each one carefully, because AP exam questions, both multiple choice and free response, will ask you to identify these components in passages and deploy them in your own writing. The 6 parts, one by one. The exordium is your opening move, and its job is pure ethos building. Think of it as the handshake before the argument begins. A skilled writer uses the exordium to capture the audience's goodwill, establish credibility, and signal the tone of everything that follows. On the AP exam, you might see a passage that opens with a compelling anecdote, a striking statistic, or a respectful acknowledgement of the reader. That's your exordium. The common mistake students make is confusing the exordium with the thesis. They're not the same thing. The exordium warms up the audience. It doesn't yet make the claim. The narration comes next, and this is where the writer provides background context. It's the "here's what's going on in the world" section. Think of a newspaper op-ed that spends its first real paragraph explaining the situation, the new policy, the recent event, the ongoing crisis before taking a stance on it. The narration establishes shared ground, a common set of facts both writer and reader can agree on before disagreement enters the room. AP readers reward you for including this because it demonstrates rhetorical awareness of your audience. The partition is a brief but crucial hinge point. This is where the writer previews the argument, essentially a roadmap that tells the audience what's coming. You might recognize this from the classic academic thesis statement that says something like, "This paper will argue X by examining Y and Z." The partition signals organizational clarity, and clarity is always rewarded on AP scoring rubrics. Some writers weave the partition into the end of the narration, so watch for that combination in MCQ passages. Now we arrive at the confirmation, which is the heart of the argument. Your evidence, your reasoning, your proof. This is where logos lives. Every piece of data, every expert citation, every logical chain of reasoning belongs here. The College Board specifically looks for your ability to distinguish between types of evidence: anecdotal, statistical, authoritative, analogical, and to evaluate how effectively a writer uses the confirmation to build their case. When you write your own argument essay on the AP exam, this section must be your longest and most carefully developed. A weak confirmation is the single most common reason students lose points on the argument FRQ. The refutation, sometimes called the concession and refutation, is where things get sophisticated. This is the section where the writer acknowledges the opposing view and then dismantles it, or at least complicates it. Think of it as a chess player saying, "I see your move, and here's why it doesn't work." The refutation does something psychologically powerful. It makes the writer appear fair-minded and thorough, which actually strengthens their credibility. Here's a critical distinction the AP exam loves to test. There's a difference between a concession, where you genuinely grant validity to part of the opposing view, and a refutation, where you counter it directly. Strong writers do both. They concede a point to show intellectual honesty, then pivot to explain why that concession doesn't defeat their overall argument. The peroration is your closing, and it's not just a summary. Think of it as the closing argument at trial, the moment when you appeal to the jury's emotions and values one final time. This is where pathos takes center stage. A great peroration doesn't just restate the thesis, it elevates the stakes, connects the argument to something larger, and leaves the audience with a call to action or a resonant emotional impression. On the AP exam, if a passage ends with an emotionally charged appeal or a return to the opening anecdote in a new light, that's your peroration. How this connects to everything else you've studied. Classical argument structure doesn't exist in isolation. It's the skeleton that the rhetorical appeals hang on. When you analyze Aristotle's appeals, ethos, pathos, logos, from Unit 1, you're really asking which appeal dominates each section of the classical structure. The exordium and peroration lean heavily on ethos and pathos. The confirmation relies on logos. The refutation blends all three. Similarly, when you study rhetorical modes in Unit 6, narration, description, cause, and effect comparison, those modes show up most often within the confirmation and narration sections. Classical structures the frame, rhetorical strategies are the tools used to build it. What trips students up on the exam? The most common MCQ trap involves confusing the refutation with the conclusion. A refutation appears in the middle of the argument because it strengthens the case before the final appeal. It's not the ending. When you see a passage that introduces "some critics argue," followed by a counter-response, that's mid-argument refutation, not conclusion. Another frequent confusion is treating the partition as optional or decorative. On the APFRQ, a clear partition signals to readers and to scorers that you are in control of your argument's architecture. Also, watch out for passages that use a modified or abbreviated classical structure. Some writers combine the narration and partition into a single paragraph or fold the refutation into the confirmation. The AP exam absolutely tests whether you can identify these hybrid forms rather than expecting a rigid, textbook-perfect six-part sequence. Putting it to work in your own writing. When you sit down to write the argument essay, use classical structure as your outline. Open with an exordium that establishes why this issue matters to your specific audience. Build your narration from the context you genuinely understand. State your partition clearly at the end of your introduction. Develop your confirmation across multiple body paragraphs with specific, varied evidence. Devote at least one paragraph to refutation. Introduce the strongest version of the opposing argument, acknowledge its merits briefly, and then explain why your position remains more compelling. Close with a peroration that rises above mere summary. Understanding classical argument structure will also sharpen your ability to read and analyze any argumentative text the exam throws at you, which means it's not just a writing tool, but a reading tool as well, and that matters enormously for the multiple choice section. With this architectural foundation in place, we're ready to zoom in on the specific rhetorical moves and stylistic choices writers make within these sections, which is exactly where we're headed next as we explore the craft of developing and supporting a thesis. 8.3 Understand Rogerian and Toulmin models of argument. Let's talk about two of the most powerful frameworks in your AP language toolkit, the Toulmin model and the Rogerian model of argument. Think of these as two very different philosophies about how you win an argument. One is a structural blueprint, like an architect's floor plan. The other is a relational strategy, more like a skilled diplomat navigating a tense negotiation. Both show up on the AP exam, both will sharpen your writing, and understanding the difference between them could be the thing that pushes your score from a 3 to a 5. The Toulmin model argument as architecture. Stephen Toulmin, a British philosopher, introduced his model in 1958, and it's become the gold standard for analyzing how arguments are built piece by piece like a well-engineered bridge. The AP exam expects you to identify and label the components of a Toulmin argument when you encounter one in a passage, and to use this structure in your own FRQ writing. Here's the model in full. At the center is the claim, the argument's main assertion, the position the writer is defending. Think of it as the destination on a road trip. Next comes the data, sometimes called grounds or evidence, the specific facts, statistics, examples, or observations that support the claim. This is the fuel in your tank. So far, so straightforward. But Toulmin's real insight is what comes next, the warrant. The warrant is the logical bridge that connects your data to your claim, the underlying assumption that makes your evidence relevant. This is the concept students miss most often on the exam, so pay close attention. Imagine someone argues Maria has lived in France for 10 years, so she must speak excellent French. The claim is that Maria speaks excellent French. The data is that she's lived there a decade. But the warrant, the unstated assumption, is that living somewhere for a long time leads to language fluency. Warrants are often implicit, buried beneath the surface of an argument. On the MCQ section, you'll frequently be asked to identify the assumption an argument depends on. That question is asking for the warrant. Toulmin also gives us 3 supporting elements. The backing provides additional support for the warrant itself. It's the evidence behind the evidence, the deeper justification. The qualifier is the language that limits how strongly the claim is stated. Words like probably, in most cases, or generally signal that the writer is being precise about the scope of the argument rather than overclaiming. The rebuttal, sometimes called the reservation, acknowledges exceptions or counterarguments, the conditions under which the claim might not hold. A sophisticated writer uses qualifiers and rebuttals not as signs of weakness, but as markers of intellectual honesty. On FRQ scoring rubrics, demonstrating complexity often means acknowledging a counterargument, which is essentially building in Toulmin's rebuttal. A common trap on the MCQ is confusing the backing with the data. Here's how to keep them straight. Data supports the claim directly, while backing supports the warrant. If someone argues that we should trust a doctor's advice, claim because the doctor has a medical degree, data, and the warrant is that degree's signal expertise, then citing medical school accreditation standards as justification for why degrees indicate expertise. That's backing. The Rogerian model argument is conversation. Now shift gears entirely. Carl Rogers was a psychologist, not a philosopher, and his approach to argument comes from therapy rather than debate. The Rogerian model treats argument not as a battle to win, but as a conversation aimed at finding common ground. If Toulmin is the chess player making bold moves toward checkmate, Rogers is the mediator sitting both sides down at a table. The structure of Rogerian argument follows a very deliberate emotional logic. You begin by introducing the problem in neutral terms. No loaded language, no immediate signaling of your position. Then, crucially, you present the opposing view fairly and charitably, showing that you genuinely understand why the other side believes what they believe. This is not a straw man, it's a steel man. You're representing the opposition at their strongest, most reasonable best. After establishing that understanding, you acknowledge the validity of the other perspective, the conditions under which their view makes sense. Only then do you introduce your own position, framed not as a demolition of their view, but as a complement or a refinement. You close by proposing a compromise or synthesis that honors both perspectives. A great real-world analogy. Imagine two neighbors arguing about a fence. A Toulmin approach might involve citing property law, measurements, and HOA codes to prove you're right. A Rogerian approach would start by genuinely acknowledging your neighbor's concern about privacy and sunlight, validating those needs, and then proposing a fence design that works for both of you. The goal isn't victory, it's resolution. On the AP exam, Rogerian argument appears in two key ways. First, you may encounter a passage that uses this structure and be asked to identify the rhetorical strategy or explain why the writer chooses this approach. The answer almost always connects to audience. Rogerian argument is especially effective when the audience is hostile, deeply invested in the opposing view, or when the writer wants to preserve a relationship while still advocating for change. Second, in your own synthesis or argument essays, adopting a Rogerian approach to counter-argument is one of the clearest ways to demonstrate the sophistication that earns the top-tier commentary point on the rubric. Keeping them straight and connecting the dots. The most common confusion on the exam is treating these as interchangeable. They are not. Toulmin is a structural model. It describes the components of any argument regardless of tone or strategy. Rogerian is a rhetorical model. It describes a specific persuasive approach designed to reduce defensiveness and build consensus. You could, in fact, write a Rogerian argument that uses Toulmin components internally. They operate on different levels. These models connect directly to your work throughout Unit 8 and beyond. When you analyze rhetoric in Unit 3, you're often examining whether a writer uses Toulmin's logical scaffolding effectively, or whether they're employing Rogerian empathy to soften a resistant audience. When you evaluate evidence quality in Units 5 and 6, you're essentially asking whether the data actually supports the claim, a Toulmin question at its core. And in every FRQ essay you write, you're making choices about how aggressive or conciliatory to be, which is the Rogerian question. One final exam tip. When a passage acknowledges the opposing view before presenting the author's own, don't automatically label it concession and refutation. Ask yourself whether the author is genuinely validating the other side's perspective or strategically dismissing it. The former is Rogerian, the latter is classical. That distinction earns you precision points on both the MCQ and the FRQ. With these two models firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to move into examining how effective writers select and deploy evidence, because knowing how to build an argument is only half the battle if your support doesn't hold up under scrutiny. 8.4 Understand appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos. The foundation of every argument you'll ever read. Let's start with a scene. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop, appropriately enough, and a friend slides a flyer across the table. It says, "Studies show that 73% of people who drink coffee before 8 a.m. report higher productivity. Join our morning wellness program. I did it myself, and it changed my life. Don't let another day slip by while you're still half asleep." In those 3 sentences, your friend has just deployed all 3 classical appeals, a statistic, a personal testimony, and an emotional nudge. That's logos, ethos, and pathos working in concert, and your ability to identify, analyze, and evaluate those moves is at the absolute heart of AP English Language and Composition. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle first systematized these appeals in his work Rhetoric, and College Board has kept them central to the AP Lang curriculum ever since. You will encounter them on nearly every multiple-choice question that asks about an author's rhetorical choices, and you will need to deploy the precise terminology in your FRQ responses, particularly the rhetorical analysis essay. So let's build this foundation brick by brick. Logos, the appeal to logic and reason. Logos is the appeal to logic. It's the part of an argument that asks your rational mind to engage. When a writer uses logos, they're saying, in effect, follow my reasoning and you'll arrive where I arrived. Logos shows up as statistical evidence, factual data, historical examples, cause and effect reasoning, analogies that clarify a logical relationship, and formal or informal deductive reasoning. Think of a surgeon explaining to a patient why a procedure is necessary. They walk through the diagnosis, the evidence from imaging, the likely progression of the disease without intervention, and the success rates of the operation. Every step is a logos move. For the AP exam, you need to recognize that logos is about more than just using facts. College Board wants you to analyze how the logical evidence functions within the argument. Ask yourself, is the writer using inductive reasoning, moving from specific examples to a general conclusion? Or deductive reasoning, applying a general principle to a specific case? Is the analogy logically sound, or does it break down under scrutiny? That last question matters enormously because one of the most common MCQ traps involves a writer using a logical-sounding analogy that actually contains a flaw. You might be asked whether the logos strengthens or undermines the argument, and the correct answer is sometimes the counterintuitive one. Ethos, the appeal to credibility and character. Ethos is the appeal to credibility. It's the part of the argument that asks you to trust the speaker or writer. And here's a crucial distinction the exam loves to test. Ethos is not just about who the writer is. It's about how the writer establishes trustworthiness within the text itself. Those are two very different things, and confusing them is one of the most common mistakes students make. A writer builds ethos through several specific moves. They might demonstrate expertise by using precise field-appropriate vocabulary. They might acknowledge opposing viewpoints fairly before refuting them. This signals intellectual honesty. They might cite credible sources, align themselves with respected institutions, or share relevant personal experience. Think about a financial advisor who says, I've navigated 3 recessions over my 30-year career, and I've seen what works and what doesn't. That's ethos through experience. Now contrast that with a celebrity endorsing a vitamin supplement. The celebrity has fame, but does their status translate into genuine credibility on the topic? That gap between perceived authority and actual authority is exactly what College Board wants you to think critically about. On your FRQ, when you analyze ethos, avoid simply saying this builds credibility. That's the weakest version of the analysis. Instead, explain what specific technique establishes credibility and why that matters for the argument's persuasive purpose and its intended audience. The scoring rubric rewards that depth of analysis. Pathos, the appeal to emotion and values. Pathos is the appeal to emotion, and this is the one students most often underestimate on the exam. Many students treat pathos as the soft appeal, less rigorous than logos, somehow less worthy of serious analysis. That instinct will cost you points. Pathos is a sophisticated, deliberate rhetorical tool, and when a skilled writer uses it, they're not manipulating irrationally. They're activating the values, fears, hopes, and sense of identity that make their audience care about the argument. Pathos works through word choice that carries emotional weight, what we call connotation and diction, through vivid narrative and imagery, through hypothetical scenarios that put the reader in someone else's shoes, and through appeals to shared values like fairness, family, freedom, or justice. Consider a public health campaign that doesn't just cite mortality statistics, but shows a photograph of a child and says every year, preventable diseases take parents away from families like hers. The statistic is logos. The photograph and the specific child are pathos. They transform abstract numbers into human stakes, a critical edge case for the exam. Pathos is not inherently manipulative, but it can be. College Board expects you to evaluate whether the emotional appeal is proportionate and honest, or whether it exploits emotion to bypass rational evaluation. An argument that uses fear to suppress legitimate counter-arguments is using pathos inappropriately. Recognizing that distinction separates a 3 response from a 5 response on the rhetorical analysis FRQ. How the 3 appeals work together. Here's the insight that will elevate your analysis. Skilled writers rarely use a single appeal in isolation. They layer all 3, calibrating the balance based on their audience, purpose, and context. A scientific paper aimed at researchers will be logos-heavy with ethos built through citations and methodology. A political speech aimed at a general audience might lead with pathos to create emotional investment, then shore up the argument with logos and ethos to make that emotional commitment feel justified and credible. Your job on the exam is not just to identify which appeal is present, but to analyze why the writer chose that balance for that rhetorical situation, which connects directly back to Unit 1's concept of audience, purpose, and context. This also connects to Unit 4's work on argument structure and to Unit 6's focus on reading complex nonfiction. When you encounter a synthesis prompt in Unit 7 and you're building your own argument, you'll be making deliberate choices about which appeals to deploy, and understanding logos, ethos, and pathos as tools you control is what makes the difference between a formulaic response and a genuinely persuasive one. The trap that catches everyone. The single most common MCQ trap around appeals is misidentifying ethos as pathos or pathos as logos. A writer who shares a personal story of loss is not automatically using pathos. If that story is positioned as evidence of expertise or as qualification to speak on a topic, it's functioning as ethos always ask. What is this piece of evidence doing in the argument? Is it building trust, activating emotion, or constructing logical proof? The function, not just the form, determines the appeal. With logos, ethos, and pathos firmly in your toolkit, you're now ready to zoom out and examine how writers construct full arguments from the ground up, which takes us right into the mechanics of claim, evidence, and reasoning in the sections ahead. 8.5. Evaluate the effectiveness of appeals. Let's talk about something you do every single day without even realizing it. You evaluate appeals. When your friend tries to convince you to skip studying and go to a party, you weigh their argument. When a commercial tells you that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend a certain toothpaste, you either buy in or raise an eyebrow. That instinct you're already using? That's exactly what the AP exam wants you to formalize and articulate in this section. We're going to take that gut feeling and turn it into a precise analytical skill that will serve you on every multiple-choice question and every free response prompt you encounter. The 3 classical appeals. A quick refresher. You already know the vocabulary, ethos, pathos, logos, but the exam doesn't just want you to identify them. It wants you to evaluate them, which means you need to ask a deeper question. Is this appeal actually working, and why or why not? Think of yourself less as a label maker and more as a critic. A food critic doesn't just point at a dish and say that's a steak. They tell you whether it's cooked well, whether it fits the menu, whether it serves the diner. That's your job here. Ethos is the appeal to credibility and character. When a retired general testifies before Congress about military strategy, his ethos is doing enormous rhetorical work. We trust him because of his lived expertise. But here's the critical nuance the AP exam loves to test. Ethos can be established, or it can be assumed, and it can also be undermined. If that same general is later revealed to have financial ties to a defense contractor, his ethos collapses. On the exam, you may be asked to evaluate whether an author's appeal to authority is actually valid, or whether it's a case of what logicians call the appeal to false authority, where credentials in one field are used to claim expertise in an unrelated one. A famous actor promoting a new cancer treatment is an ethos appeal, but it is a deeply ineffective one, because fame is not medical expertise. Pathos is the appeal to emotion, and it is simultaneously the most powerful and the most dangerous tool in a rhetorician's kit. Pathos becomes effective when the emotion it evokes is appropriate to the argument and leads the audience toward a reasonable conclusion. Think of a nonprofit's advertisement that shows a real photograph of a child affected by famine. The emotional response is proportionate to the actual severity of the issue, and it motivates real action. Pathos becomes ineffective and ethically suspect when it exploits emotion to bypass logic entirely. Fear-mongering in political speeches, for example, can trigger strong emotional responses that prevent audiences from thinking critically. On the AP exam, a common trap is assuming that any emotional appeal is manipulative. It is not. Your job is to evaluate whether the emotional appeal is proportionate, relevant, and honest. Logos is the appeal to logic, evidence, and reason. An effective logos appeal uses accurate data, sound reasoning, and valid evidence to support a claim, but logos too can fail. Watch out for what the College Board calls logical fallacies, which are flaws in the reasoning structure. The exam frequently features passages where an author uses statistics that sound compelling but are actually misleading. Cherry-picked data, correlation confused with causation, or overly broad generalizations from a small sample size. When you're evaluating logos, always ask, is the evidence sufficient, relevant, and representative? If a persuasive essay claims that crime is rising because one city's crime rate went up last year, that's weak logos. The evidence doesn't support the scale of the claim. The evaluative framework you need. Here's the mental framework that will unlock your analysis every time. When you encounter an appeal on the exam, ask yourself 4 questions. First, what type of appeal is being used? Second, is it appropriate for the audience and context? Third, is it sufficient? Does it actually provide enough support to carry the argumentative weight being placed on it? And fourth, does it strengthen or weaken the overall argument? That last question is where most students get tripped up. An appeal can be present and recognizable but still be rhetorically ineffective, even counterproductive. This connects directly back to Unit 7's work on rhetorical situation. The effectiveness of any appeal depends entirely on its context. A highly emotional appeal might be perfect in a eulogy and completely inappropriate in a scientific report. Pathos that resonates with one audience might alienate another. You cannot evaluate an appeal in a vacuum. You always have to ask whether it fits the specific occasion, audience, and purpose of the piece. Common exam traps to avoid. The most common wrong answer trap on multiple choice questions is confusing presence with effectiveness. The question won't just ask you to identify an appeal, it will ask you to explain what the appeal accomplishes or whether it successfully supports the author's argument. If you see an answer choice that correctly names an appeal but mischaracterizes what it does in context, eliminate it immediately. Another trap involves what might be called the everything is manipulation fallacy in students' own thinking. The exam will sometimes offer passages that use emotional language or appeal to authority in entirely legitimate ways, and students who have been taught to be suspicious of these techniques may incorrectly flag them as weaknesses. Read carefully. Ask whether the appeal is honest and proportionate before deciding it's a problem. On free response questions, particularly the rhetorical analysis essay, you earn scoring points not just for identifying appeals, but for explaining the relationship between the appeal and the argument's overall effectiveness. Phrases like, "This appeal is effective because it establishes trust with a skeptical audience," or "This appeal weakens the author's credibility," because the emotional example distracts from the central claim, show the evaluative thinking that earns top scores. The rubric specifically rewards commentary that moves beyond identification into genuine analysis of how and why rhetorical choices work or don't work. Connecting to the bigger picture? This section is the analytical heart of the entire argumentation unit, and it echoes skills from every corner of the course. In Unit 4, you studied how evidence functions within arguments. That work feeds directly into evaluating logos. In Unit 6, you examined how authors build style and tone that connects to how ethos and pathos are constructed through word choice and syntax. When you read the synthesis prompt in the FRQ section, you will be using appeals yourself, which means understanding their effectiveness isn't just a reading skill, it's a writing skill too. The bottom line is this: Evaluating appeals means you're asking the most important question in all of rhetoric, not just what is being said, but whether it works and why. Master that question, and the argumentation section of this exam becomes genuinely enjoyable. Coming up next, we'll look at how authors deliberately respond to opposing arguments through the art of refutation and concession, and why knowing when to acknowledge the other side is itself one of the most powerful rhetorical moves in a writer's arsenal. 8.6. Identifying and analyzing logical fallacies. Let's imagine you're watching a political debate, and one candidate says to the other, "My opponent wants to raise taxes. Clearly, he hates working families." You probably feel something is off about that statement, even if you can't immediately name what it is. That instinct is exactly what this section is going to sharpen into a precise analytical skill. Logical fallacies are errors in reasoning. Moments when an argument sounds convincing but actually falls apart under scrutiny. For the AP English language exam, your job isn't just to spot them, it's to name them, explain how they function rhetorically, and analyze why they're persuasive even when they're wrong. What logical fallacies actually are, the College Board wants you to think of logical fallacies as flaws in the structure of an argument, not just in its content. A fallacy can contain true facts and still be logically invalid. This distinction matters enormously on the exam. When you analyze a fallacy, you're not saying the claim is factually false, you're saying the reasoning used to support it doesn't hold up. An argument can be factually accurate and logically fallacious at the same time. Keep that in your back pocket, because AP free response questions will absolutely ask you to make exactly that distinction. The core fallacies you must know. Start with ad hominem, which in Latin means against the person. This is the debate example we opened with, attacking the arguer rather than the argument. The moment someone says you can't trust her opinion on climate change, she failed high school biology. They've committed an ad hominem. Even if she did fail biology, that fact doesn't actually disprove her argument. On the AP exam, ad hominem often appears in passages where a speaker subtly discredits a source's character instead of engaging with the substance of their claim. It's the rhetorical equivalent of flipping the chessboard instead of making a move. Next is the straw man fallacy, and this one is sneaky. A straw man occurs when someone misrepresents or exaggerates an opponent's position to make it easier to attack. Think of it like a scarecrow. It looks like a person from a distance, but it can't actually fight back. If a congressman argues against a modest gun safety bill by saying, "My colleague wants to leave every American completely defenseless," that's a straw man. The colleague said no such thing. AP passages frequently present straw man arguments in editorial writing and political speeches. So train yourself to ask, is this person responding to what was actually said or to a distorted version of it? The false dichotomy, sometimes called the either-or fallacy, is equally common and equally seductive. This fallacy presents only two options when in reality more exist. You're either with us or against us is the classic formulation. The fallacy works because it creates urgency and simplicity. Nuance gets bulldozed. On the exam, false dichotomies tend to appear in persuasive passages where the writer is trying to force the reader into a corner. Your analytical move is to identify the excluded middle ground. What other options were conveniently left out? The slippery slope fallacy argues that one event will inevitably lead to a chain of increasingly extreme consequences without sufficient evidence that any step in the chain will actually occur. If we allow students to revise one essay, soon they'll demand to retake every exam, and eventually no one will be held accountable for anything. Each step sounds plausible in isolation, but the logical chain is speculative. On the AP exam, slippery slope arguments are particularly common in op-ed passages and policy arguments. The key analytical question is always, does the author provide evidence that each step in the chain is likely, or are they just asserting it? Hasty generalization occurs when someone draws a broad conclusion from a small or unrepresentative sample. I know 3 people who tried that diet and got sick, so it must be dangerous. That's a hasty generalization. It's the statistical version of touching a hot stove once and concluding that all stoves are always burning. AP readers want you to recognize when an arguer is using anecdotal or limited evidence to support a sweeping claim. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this is a causation fallacy. Just because event B followed event A doesn't mean it caused B. A mayor implements a new policy, and crime drops the next year. The mayor claims credit. But crime might have dropped for a dozen unrelated reasons. This fallacy appears heavily in arguments about economics, public health, and social policy. Whenever you see a cause and effect claim in an AP passage, pause and ask, is the causal link actually established or just implied by sequence? Bandwagon, also called ad populum, argues that something is true, good, or correct simply because many people believe it or do it. Everyone knows social media is ruining society is a bandwagon move dressed up as a consensus, appeal to authority. Or ad verecundium is the closely related cousin, citing an authority figure's opinion as though it settles a debate, especially when that authority isn't actually an expert in the relevant field. A celebrity endorsing a medical treatment is a textbook appeal to false authority. Students often confuse these two. Bandwagon is about popular opinion, while appeal to authority is about credentialed voices. Both are fallacious when used as substitutes for actual evidence. Exam strategy, what AP readers are looking for. On multiple-choice questions, the most common trap is conflating what the fallacy sounds like with how it actually functions in the passage. A passage might contain emotionally charged language and a straw man, and the question will ask which rhetorical strategy undermines the argument's logic. Your job is to focus on the reasoning structure, not just the tone. Ask yourself, what claim is being made, what evidence or reasoning is offered in support, and where does the logical connection break down? For free response questions, particularly the rhetorical analysis and argument essays, you earn points not just for identifying a fallacy, but for explaining why it works, rhetorically. Fallacies are often persuasively effective, even when logically invalid. Your analysis should acknowledge that tension. A slippery slope might frighten an audience into agreement precisely because the chain of consequences feels plausible. College Board rewards nuanced analysis that accounts for both the logical flaw and the rhetorical effect. Connections across units. Logical fallacies connect directly to Unit 3's work on rhetorical appeals. Specifically, fallacies often masquerade as legitimate logos while actually functioning through pathos or ethos manipulation. They also link to Unit 7's coverage of evidence and claims. A fallacy is frequently a claim supported by evidence that doesn't actually prove what the arguer says it proves. When you're writing your own argument essay in Unit 9, avoiding fallacies in your own reasoning is itself a scoring criterion. AP readers will note when a student's reasoning is circular, overgeneralized, or based on a false dichotomy. Now that you can both identify and analyze logical fallacies with precision, you're ready to apply those skills to something even more demanding, evaluating the overall strength and coherence of a complete argument, which is exactly where we're headed next. 8.7 Concession and Refutation Strategies. Let's talk about one of the most sophisticated moves a writer can make in an argument, and one of the most reliably tested skills on your AP Lang exam. Imagine you're in a debate with someone, and instead of pretending their counter-argument doesn't exist, you look them in the eye and say, you know what? You have a point, but here's why I still think I'm right. That moment, that intellectually honest, rhetorically powerful moment, is exactly what concession and refutation are all about. What concession and refutation actually mean, the College Board expects you to understand these two strategies as distinct but deeply connected moves in argumentative writing. A concession is when a writer acknowledges the validity, partial truth, or legitimacy of an opposing viewpoint. A refutation is when a writer then counters that opposing view, dismantling it with evidence, logic, or reframing. Think of them as a 1-2 punch. You give a little ground to show you're reasonable, then you reclaim that ground by demonstrating why your position still holds. Here's an analogy that sticks. Imagine a lawyer in a courtroom. She's defending her client, but she knows the jury has seen some troubling evidence. A weak lawyer ignores that evidence and hopes no one notices. A brilliant lawyer says, yes, my client was at the scene. I won't deny that. However, being present does not mean committing a crime, and here's what the actual evidence shows. She's just made a concession and a refutation in 2 sentences. The jury trusts her more because she didn't dodge, and she's neutralized the opposing point before it could do damage. Why these strategies matter for your score on the AP Lang exam. Both the multiple-choice section and the free response questions, especially the argument essay and the synthesis essay, reward writers who engage seriously with complexity. The scoring rubrics for the argument essay explicitly use the term counter-argument, and essays that earn a 6 or higher on the commentary score out of 6 almost always demonstrate that the writer can anticipate objections and address them. A student who presents only one side of an issue is, in the College Board's eyes, presenting a simplistic argument. Students who concede and refute are demonstrating what the rubric calls a nuanced understanding of the complexity of the topic. This is also a critical reading skill for the MCQ section. You'll encounter passages where an author makes a concession, and the question will ask you to identify the rhetorical purpose of a particular paragraph or sentence. If you don't recognize the concession refutation structure, you might misread that paragraph as the author agreeing with an opposing view, when in fact the author is strategically yielding ground before pushing back. The anatomy of a concession refutation move. Let's get specific about structure because the AP exam rewards precision. A full concession refutation typically follows this pattern: the acknowledgement, the pivot, and the counterclaim. The acknowledgement names or summarizes the opposing view fairly, not a straw man version, but the strongest version of it. This is called a steel-manned argument, though the College Board won't use that term. The pivot is the linguistic hinge that signals the shift, words and phrases like, however, nevertheless, while it is true that, although, granted, and even so. The counterclaim then presents the writer's position with renewed force, often backed by evidence. A student might write, while critics of standardized testing rightly point out that such exams can reflect socioeconomic disparities rather than raw academic ability, this concern actually strengthens the argument for reforming rather than eliminating the tests, since equitable access to test preparation is a solvable policy problem. Notice how that sentence validates the opposing concern, rightly point out, pivots with this concern actually, and then reframes the criticism as support for a modified version of the original position. That's sophisticated argumentation, and it's exactly what earns high commentary scores. Common traps and misconceptions. Here's the trap students fall into most often: confusing a concession with a contradiction. If you concede too much if you write opponents of my position are completely correct, you've essentially abandoned your argument. A concession should be partial and strategic, not a full surrender. The College Board distinguishes between writers who make insightful concessions that strengthen their overall argument and writers who create unresolved contradictions that undermine it. A second trap is making a concession without following it with a refutation. This is the rhetorical equivalent of saying, fair point, and then walking away. In your essays, every concession must be tethered to a countermove. Leaving a concession dangling is actually worse than not making one at all, because you've introduced doubt without resolving it. A third misconception is thinking that concession shows weakness. This one is deeply counterintuitive, but the research on rhetoric backs it up. Audiences find writers who acknowledge opposing views more credible, not less. When you show you understand the other side, you demonstrate intellectual honesty and build ethos, one of those 3 Aristotelian appeals you've been studying all year. Concession is, paradoxically, one of the most powerful tools for establishing authority. Connecting to other units and concepts. This topic sits at the intersection of several things you've already studied. From Unit 3, you know that ethos is about credibility. Concession builds ethos by signaling fairness. From Unit 7, you understand how rhetorical situation shapes argumentative choices. The degree to which a writer concedes often depends on audience. A writer addressing a skeptical or hostile audience might concede more frequently and more generously, because that audience needs to feel heard before they'll open their minds to persuasion. Concession refutation also connects directly to logical fallacies from Unit 8. The straw man fallacy, misrepresenting an opposing view to make it easier to defeat, is essentially a failed or dishonest concession. When you identify a straw man in an MCQ passage, you're recognizing that the writer has pretended to engage with the opposing view without actually doing so fairly. In the synthesis essay, which draws on multiple sources, you'll often need to concede the perspective of one source while refuting it using another. Recognizing which sources represent the concession and which represent the refutation in a synthesis argument is a high-level analytical skill that separates 5 seconds from 3 seconds. A final word before you move on. Practice spotting these moves in everything you read. Op-eds, speeches, academic essays. When you see a although or a to be sure or a critics argue, pause and ask yourself, is the writer about to concede? And if so, what's their refutation coming next? That habit of reading like a rhetorician is what the AP exam is really testing. Coming up next, we'll look at how these strategies of concession and refutation connect to the broader craft of building a cohesive, unified, argumentative structure. Because a strong argument isn't just a collection of smart moves, it's a piece of writing where every move serves the whole. 8.8 Developing a nuanced, defensible claim or thesis. Let's talk about the single most important sentence, sometimes 2 sentences. You will write on the AP language exam, your thesis. Everything else you do in that free response section either builds toward it or flows from it, and yet it's also the place where students lose the most points without fully understanding why. So let's get this right. What defensible actually means. Start with the word defensible. College Board uses this term with real precision, and you should too. A defensible claim is one that a reasonable, intelligent person could argue against. That's it. That's the whole definition, and it has enormous implications. Think of it like a courtroom. If you're a defense attorney, you don't take cases where the outcome is guaranteed. You take cases where there's something to argue, where evidence actually matters, where your reasoning makes a difference. A thesis that says pollution is bad for the environment isn't defensible. It's just true. Nobody's going to cross-examine you on that. But a thesis that says government regulation is a more effective tool for reducing corporate pollution than consumer choice. Now, that's a trial worth watching. Someone could push back. Someone could argue the opposite. And that pushback potential is exactly what makes your thesis strong on the AP exam. Especially the argument FRQ, students constantly confuse defensible with controversial. You don't need to take an incendiary position that shocks everyone in the room. You just need to take a position, a real specific arguable one. If your thesis could appear at the end of any encyclopedia article as a neutral summary, it's probably not defensible, it's just descriptive. What nuanced actually means. Now let's tackle the word that trips up even strong writers, nuanced. When College Board says your thesis should be nuanced, they mean it should demonstrate complexity of thought. It should acknowledge that the world doesn't operate in simple binaries. Here's a great analogy. Imagine you're a doctor explaining why someone is healthy or sick. The unsophisticated answer is, you eat well, you're healthy. You eat badly, you're sick. But a real doctor knows that genetics, stress, sleep, environment, and dozens of other variables interact in complicated ways. A nuanced medical diagnosis respects that complexity. Your thesis should do the same thing for your argument. In practical terms, nuance usually appears in one of 3 ways. First, you can qualify your claim. Instead of saying social media is harmful to teenagers, you say, while social media provides genuine communities for isolated young people, its algorithmic design creates measurable psychological harm that outweighs these benefits. That while clause is doing real intellectual work. Second, you can identify a causal relationship with conditions attached. Technology accelerates economic inequality primarily in societies that fail to invest in workforce retraining. Third, you can make a comparative claim that evaluates competing factors. Cultural pressure, more than legal restriction, has historically driven the most durable changes in public behavior. Each of these moves acknowledges complexity. Each one invites a sophisticated argument rather than a simplistic one. And crucially, each one gives you a roadmap for the body of your essay, which connects directly to how College Board scores the commentary and evidence rows of the FRQ rubric. The thesis row on the rubric. Let's talk about scoring, because this is an AP review and you need the specifics on the argument. FRQ, the thesis row, is worth 1 point. You earn it by responding to the prompt with a thesis that makes a defensible claim and establishes a line of reasoning, meaning your thesis shouldn't just state what you think, it should gesture toward why or how you think it. That line of reasoning phrase matters enormously. A thesis that says freedom of speech should have limits earns 0 points because it doesn't establish a line of reasoning. It's just a position floating in space. A thesis that says freedom of speech should have limits when expression causes demonstrable harm to vulnerable groups because rights are meaningful only insofar as they protect rather than endanger human dignity. That earns the point. The because clause isn't just decoration. It's the intellectual architecture of your entire essay. You can write a 1-sentence thesis or a 2-sentence thesis. College Board doesn't care about sentence count. What they care about is whether your claim is defensible and whether your reader can see the shape of your argument coming. Think of your thesis as a preview of the essay's logic, not just the essay's conclusion. Where students lose points, the most common traps, the most common mistake is what I call the announcement problem. Students write things like, "In this essay I will argue that," and then state something extremely broad. That phrasing signals to the reader and to the scorer that you haven't committed to a real position. You're announcing that an argument is coming without actually making one. Scorers don't give partial credit for promising to argue something later. You have to argue it now in the thesis. The second major trap is restating the prompt. If the prompt says, write an essay that argues your position on whether technology has changed human connection, and your thesis says technology has changed human connection in many ways, you've essentially just repeated the question back in statement form. That's not a claim. That's an observation that the topic exists. The third trap is false balance. Students sometimes write thesis statements that say there are good points on both sides. That's not nuance. That's paralysis. True nuance doesn't mean refusing to take a side. It means taking a side while acknowledging complexity. You can absolutely concede something to the opposition in your thesis, but you have to land somewhere clear and specific. Connecting this to the rest of the course. Your thesis is the engine that powers everything in Unit 8, but it also connects back to the rhetorical skills you studied all year. The appeals you analyzed in Unit 3, ethos, logos, pathos, those are the tools you use to defend your thesis. The rhetorical situation concepts from Unit 1 remind you that your thesis should account for audience and purpose. And the synthesis skills from Unit 7 matter enormously here because a nuanced thesis in the synthesis FRQ has to emerge from careful reading of multiple sources, not just your prior opinions. One last thing to keep in your toolkit. The best theses often come from a moment of genuine intellectual tension. When you read the prompt and think, well, it depends, that's not uncertainty, that's nuance trying to emerge. Lean into that instinct, name the condition it depends on, and you've got the foundation of a scoring thesis. Coming up next, we'll look at how to build the body of your argument so that every paragraph earns its place by connecting back to that thesis you've now perfected. 8.9 Line of reasoning, organizing claims and evidence coherently. Picture this. You're watching a lawyer make their closing argument in court. They don't just stand up and say, my client is innocent, trust me. Instead, they walk the jury through a carefully constructed sequence of points. Here's what the evidence shows. Here's why that matters. Here's what it means for the verdict. Each step builds on the last, and by the time they sit down, the jury feels like they've been guided along a well-lit path rather than shoved into a maze. That right there is a line of reasoning in action, and mastering it is arguably the single most important skill you can demonstrate on the AP English Language and Composition exam. What the line of reasoning actually is. The College Board defines the line of reasoning as the logical sequence of claims and evidence that a writer uses to build and support a thesis. Think of it as the skeleton of your argument. The thesis is the head. Each body paragraph is a vertebra, and the transitions are the connective tissue that holds the whole thing upright. Without a coherent line of reasoning, even the most brilliant individual claim floats in space with nothing to anchor it. The AP exam graders are specifically looking for whether your essay moves with purpose, with each part of your argument following logically from what came before and setting up what comes next. Here's a distinction you absolutely need to have locked down. A line of reasoning is not just a list of reasons. Students fall into this trap constantly. They write 3 body paragraphs that each technically support the thesis, but the paragraphs have no relationship to one another. They could appear in any order, and the essay would read exactly the same. That's a collection of claims, not a line of reasoning. The difference is logical progression. Each claim should either build on the previous one or address a necessary counterpoint before moving forward. Imagine climbing a staircase versus standing in a pile of bricks. The bricks might all be the same material, but only the staircase gets you somewhere. How claims and evidence work together. Every step in your line of reasoning requires both a claim and evidence. But, and this is crucial, evidence alone is never enough. This is one of the most common scoring failures on the free response questions. Students find a powerful quotation or a compelling data point, drop it into the paragraph, and move on, expecting the reader to connect the dots. The AP rubric won't reward that. You must explain what the evidence shows and why it supports your specific claim in this specific argumentative context. College Board calls this commentary or analysis, and without it, your line of reasoning has gaps, the logical equivalent of a bridge with missing planks. Think of it this way. Evidence is like a piece of a puzzle. Holding up a puzzle piece and saying, "See, it's the sky," doesn't prove anything unless you show where it fits in the larger picture. Your commentary is what places the piece, explains its shape, and demonstrates how it completes the image you're building. Organizing for coherence. The sequence problem. When you're planning your essay under time pressure, one of the most valuable 30 seconds you can spend is asking yourself, in what order must these claims appear so that each one makes sense? Some logical arrangements that AP exam graders reward include moving from the most obvious or concrete claim to the most complex or abstract one, a structure that mirrors how understanding builds. Another effective arrangement is moving through time if your argument has a cause and effect structure. You might also organize around a concession and refutation, where you acknowledge the strongest objection to your thesis before dismantling it, which demonstrates the kind of sophisticated reasoning that earns you points in the upper scoring range. Transitions are the visible evidence of your line of reasoning. When you write furthermore, or in addition, you're signaling that you're adding a parallel point. When you write however or although, you're signaling a pivot or complication. When you write as a result or this suggests that, you're signaling a logical consequence. AP graders read transitions as road signs. They tell you whether the writer actually knows where the argument is going. Weak or absent transitions are one of the clearest signals that a line of reasoning is not fully developed, so treat them as connective tissue, not decoration. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. On the multiple choice section, questions about a writer's line of reasoning often ask you to identify why a particular piece of evidence appears where it does or what function a specific paragraph serves in the overall argument. The trap is choosing the answer that accurately describes the content of the paragraph rather than its function in the argument sequence. Always ask, why does this claim appear here at this moment? What does its placement accomplish? That functional thinking is what the correct answer will reflect on the FRQ. The scoring rubric distinguishes between essays that merely state a claim and those that develop a line of reasoning. A score in the middle range typically shows multiple reasons with evidence, but those reasons don't build on each other in a clear logical chain. To reach the top scoring tier, your argument must demonstrate what College Board describes as sophistication. And one of the primary ways to achieve that is by showing how your claims are not just individually supportable, but mutually reinforcing. Your final body paragraph should feel like a payoff, not a coincidence. Connections to other units and concepts. The line of reasoning is the backbone of everything you've studied in Units 5 through 8. When you analyzed rhetorical strategies in earlier units, ethos, pathos, logos, you were essentially analyzing how other writers construct their lines of reasoning. When you studied evidence in Unit 7, you were learning the raw materials. Now in Unit 8, you're learning architecture. The skill also connects directly to how you read and analyze source synthesis essays, where you must organize evidence from multiple sources into a coherent argument rather than a patchwork summary. Recognizing a line of reasoning in a source's text and building one in your own essay are two sides of the same analytical coin. One final analogy to carry with you: a well-built line of reasoning is like giving someone directions. You don't just list every road in the city, you tell them exactly which turn to take and why, in the order they'll need it. Your readers should always know where they are in your argument and feel confident that you know where you're taking them. Now that you understand how to organize your claims into a coherent, purposeful sequence, we're going to look at how the most sophisticated arguments do more than just make their case. They anticipate objections, complicate their own claims, and ultimately demonstrate the kind of nuanced thinking that separates a good essay from an exceptional one. 8.10 Commentary and Explanation: Connecting Evidence to Claims. Let's talk about the single most common reason a well-intentioned AP Lang essay falls flat, and it's not a lack of evidence. Students find evidence. They quote it, they cite it, they drop it into their paragraphs like little gifts, but then they walk away. They assume the evidence speaks for itself. And here's the thing: it never does. That gap between evidence and claim, that space where meaning is made, is exactly what commentary and explanation are for. Mastering this skill is the difference between a score of 3 and a score of 5. What commentary actually is? Think of it this way. Imagine you're in a courtroom. You're the lawyer. You've just presented a piece of physical evidence, say a fingerprint. Do you sit down and let the jury figure out what it means? Absolutely not. You walk them through it. You explain whose fingerprint it is, how it got there, and exactly why that proves your client is innocent. That explanation, that bridge between the object and its meaning, is your commentary. In AP Lang terms, commentary is the analytical reasoning you provide after presenting evidence to show how and why that evidence supports your claim. The College Board is very specific about this in the scoring rubric for the argument FRQ. A response that earns a 4 in the evidence and commentary row doesn't just include evidence. It consistently explains how that evidence connects to the line of reasoning. If you're aiming for a 5, your commentary needs to do more than state the obvious. It needs to interpret, analyze, and demonstrate sophisticated thinking about why the evidence matters. The evidence, warrant, claim structure. You may have heard of the Toulmin model in your class, and this is exactly where it applies. Every argumentative move you make has 3 parts: the claim, what you're arguing; the evidence, what supports it; and the warrant, why the evidence supports the claim. The warrant is your commentary. It's the logical bridge, and the problem is that student writers treat it as optional. It is not optional. On the AP exam, it is the most heavily weighted analytical move you can make. Here's a real-world analogy that makes this concrete. Suppose you're trying to convince a friend that a particular restaurant is overpriced. You say, "Look, a bowl of pasta is $25. That's your evidence." Your friend shrugs. "So what?" Now you add, "That's the same price as 2 pounds of fresh pasta, a bottle of wine, and enough sauce to feed 4 people at home." You're paying $25 for about $2 worth of ingredients and the experience of sitting at a crowded table. Now your friend gets it. You've provided commentary. You've connected the evidence to the actual claim that the restaurant overcharges. AP graders are your skeptical friends. They need you to explain the so what. How to write effective commentary. Strong commentary does 3 things in sequence. First, it interprets. It explains what the evidence means in plain terms, making sure the reader knows exactly what they're supposed to take away from it. Second, it analyzes. It goes deeper, explaining the mechanisms at work, the implications, or the reasoning that makes the evidence relevant. Third, it links. It explicitly connects back to your claim, often restating or extending it to show how the argument has advanced. A practical method you can use right now is the because, therefore, and this shows technique. After you introduce evidence, force yourself to complete the sentence, "This matters because and therefore, and this shows that my claim is true because..." You won't write it exactly that mechanically in your essay, but the discipline of completing those 3 moves trains you to do all 3 parts of effective commentary automatically. Another approach is to ask yourself the so what question 3 times, each time at a deeper level. First, so what? What does this evidence literally show? Second, so what? Why does that matter to the argument? Third, so what? What broader truth or principle does this reveal about the world? The third so what is where sophisticated commentary lives, and it's exactly the kind of thinking that earns you the complexity point in the sophistication row. Common exam traps and misconceptions. The most dangerous misconception is what you might call, quote, and run. You introduce evidence and then immediately move to your next piece of evidence without any explanation at all. AP graders have a term for this pattern in their notes: evidence without analysis. It scores in the lower half of the rubric every time, regardless of how good your evidence is. A related trap is shallow commentary. You explain the evidence, but only at the surface level. You restate it in different words rather than actually analyzing it. This is technically commentary, but it earns you nothing extra on the rubric. If your commentary is essentially a paraphrase of the evidence, you've done the first step of interpretation but skipped analysis and linkage entirely. The third trap is what happens in the synthesis FRQ specifically. Students use a source and then say something like, source B also supports this idea. That's a transition, not commentary. Naming a source is not the same as explaining how and why it advances your argument. The College Board is looking for you to do the analytical work, not just the bookkeeping. Connections across the course. This skill connects directly to everything you've done in Unit 4 on rhetorical analysis. When you analyze how an author builds an argument, looking at their appeals, their evidence, their rhetorical choices, you're essentially modeling what you need to do in your own writing. The analytical lens you use to dissect someone else's argument is the same lens you apply when explaining your own evidence. Commentary also connects to Unit 6, where you studied the components of argumentation. Your claims, grounds, warrants, and backing are all in play here. The warrant in Toulmin's model is exactly what commentary provides. And in Unit 9, when you encounter the synthesis FRQ, every source you bring into your argument needs this same treatment. Not just citation, but explanation of how it functions within your specific line of reasoning. Think of building an argument like constructing a bridge. Your claims are the towers, your evidence is the cables. But commentary? Commentary is the tension that holds the cables taut and keeps the whole structure from collapsing into the river. Without it, you have expensive-looking pieces that don't actually connect anything. The good news is this: commentary is a learnable, practicable skill. The more you write it, the more automatic it becomes, and the more naturally you'll start to see the so what in everything you read, which brings us perfectly to our next topic, where we look at how to evaluate and select the right kinds of evidence in the first place. 8.1. The Argument FRQ, Understanding the Prompt and Task. Let's talk about the argument-free response question. The third and final essay on your AP Language and Composition exam, and honestly, the one that students most often misunderstand before they even write a single word. Here's a scenario I see all the time. A student sits down, reads the prompt, and thinks, great, I just need to pick a side and write. And then they spend 40 minutes doing exactly that, without ever truly understanding what the College Board was asking them to do. That's like someone handing you a recipe and you just start throwing ingredients into a pan without reading whether you're supposed to bake, sauté, or broil. The result might look like food, but it's probably not what anyone wanted. What the Argument FRQ actually is: the Argument FRQ gives you a short written prompt, usually just a few sentences or a brief quotation, that presents a debatable claim or idea. Your job is to write a well-reasoned argument that defends, challenges, or qualifies the claim made in the prompt. Notice those three options: defend, challenge, or qualify. The College Board calls this a position statement structure. And understanding the difference between those three verbs is one of the most important distinctions you can make before you write anything. To defend means you're agreeing with the claim and providing evidence and reasoning to support it. To challenge means you disagree and are arguing against it. But qualify, that's where most students either shine or stumble. To qualify a claim means you're saying something like, this is true, but only under certain conditions, or this is partially true, but the picture is more complicated than the prompt suggests. Qualification is the most sophisticated rhetorical move, and the College Board rewards it. Think of it like a seasoned judge who says, yes, the defendant has a point, but context matters here. Qualification acknowledges complexity without abandoning your position. Dissecting the prompt itself. Before you write, you need to do something that feels slow but is actually the fastest path to a high score. Read the prompt carefully and identify the core claim. Every argument FRQ prompt contains a debatable proposition, an assertion that a reasonable person could agree with, disagree with, or complicate. Common topics include human nature, technology, education, civic responsibility, art, progress, individualism versus collectivism, and the relationship between personal ambition and social good. Here's a useful strategy. After you read the prompt, ask yourself, what is the heart of this claim? Underline or mentally isolate the key assertion. Then ask, is this always true, never true, true sometimes, under specific conditions? That third question is your doorway into a qualified argument, which is often the most intellectually honest and persuasive path. One important clarification the College Board makes, and this trips up students all the time, is that the argument FRQ is not based on a provided source. Unlike the synthesis FRQ, you're not given documents to cite. You bring the evidence yourself. That means you need to draw on your own knowledge, reading, experiences, observations, and reasoning. Students sometimes freeze because they worry they don't know enough. Here's the truth. The College Board isn't testing your encyclopedic memory. They're testing your ability to reason clearly and support a position with specific, credible evidence. A well-developed example from history, literature, science, current events, or even a carefully framed personal experience can all be legitimate evidence as long as it's relevant and accurately deployed. The task verbs and why they're non-negotiable. The phrase defend, challenge, or qualify is what College Board calls the task of the prompt, and your response must do one of those three things clearly. This connects directly to AP Language's broader emphasis on rhetorical purpose. Just as you analyze an author's purpose in a passage, you must establish and execute your own purpose in this essay. Notice that the College Board says, or not, and you don't need to do all three. In fact, trying to defend and challenge and qualify in equal measure often produces an unfocused, wishy-washy essay that scores in the middle. The highest-scoring essays make a clear, specific claim, a thesis, and then develop that claim with coherence and sophistication. Your thesis should not just restate the prompt. It should stake out your position and hint at the reasoning behind it. Think of a strong thesis as a preview of your argument, not just a declaration of your opinion. Connecting to the broader units. This FRQ doesn't exist in isolation. Everything you've studied about rhetorical analysis in Units 1 through 7 feeds directly into this task. When you write your own argument, you're enacting the same rhetorical decisions you've been analyzing in other people's writing all year. Your use of evidence connects to Unit 6's focus on evidence and commentary. Your organizational choices connect to Unit 7's work on arrangement and structure. Even your attention to audience and purpose. Central ideas from Unit 2 matters here, because the College Board is implicitly your audience, and your purpose is to persuade, inform, and demonstrate sophisticated thinking. Common traps and how to avoid them. The biggest trap is treating this essay like a 5-paragraph opinion piece from middle school. A thesis like, I agree that technology is bad for society, with 3 supporting paragraphs, is not what College Board is looking for. The exam rewards what the rubric calls sophistication, the ability to address complexity, acknowledge counterarguments, or situate your argument in a broader context. You don't have to write a counter-argument, but the best essays usually gesture toward the limits of their own position or the conditions under which the opposite might be true. Another trap is using vague, unsupported evidence, saying, many studies show without naming anything specific, or invoking society as if it's a single entity, weakens your argument. Be specific. The fall of the Roman Empire? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 2008 financial crisis? These are concrete, and concrete details signal a prepared, confident writer. Finally, watch your time. You have 40 minutes for this essay. Spend 2 to 3 minutes unpacking the prompt and forming a position, then write. Don't let planning eat your drafting time. With a clear understanding of what the prompt is asking and the 3 paths you can take to answer it, you're already ahead of most students who walk into the exam. Next, we'll look at how to build a thesis and structure your argument so that your position doesn't just land, it persuades. 8.12 Building an Argument Without Provided Sources. Let's talk about what happens when the College Board takes away the training wheels. In the synthesis essay, you get 6 sources and a prompt, and your job is to weave them together. But the argument essay, what you'll encounter as free response question 3, strips all of that away. No sources, no passages. Just you, a blank page, and a debatable claim about human experience. This is where students either freeze up or shine. And by the end of this section, you're going to shine. What the task actually asks of you. The argument prompt will give you a short passage, typically a paragraph or 2 presenting a claim, a position, or a thought-provoking statement. You are not summarizing that statement. You are not explaining it. You are responding to it with your own argument, built entirely from your own evidence, your own reasoning, and your own rhetorical choices. Think of it like this. The prompt is someone at the coffee shop saying something bold. People only change when they're forced to. Your job isn't to repeat what they said. Your job is to sit across from them, look them in the eye, and make a compelling case for what you actually think, backed up by everything you know. The College Board scoring rubric for this question awards points in 3 categories: thesis, evidence and commentary, and sophistication. Understanding exactly what each category demands is non-negotiable if you want to score a 5. Crafting a defensible thesis. Your thesis must make a claim that responds to the prompt and is defensible, meaning a reasonable person could disagree with it. This distinction matters enormously. If you write World War II had many causes, you have stated a fact, not a claim. That earns you nothing. But if you write while economic desperation created the conditions for extremism, it was the failure of international institutions to enforce accountability that truly enabled World War II, you now have a position someone could push back on. That's a thesis. Here's the trap that snags so many students, writing a thesis that is merely a restatement of the prompt's claim. If the prompt says technology isolates people and you write, I agree that technology isolates people, you have not added anything, you've just nodded along. The rubric requires that your thesis do intellectual work. It needs to reflect your reasoning, not echo the prompt's phrasing. Your thesis can agree, disagree, or complicate the prompt's assertion, and complicating it is often the path to the sophistication point. Complicating means you're saying something like this is true in certain circumstances, but the more important truth is this. You're not sitting on the fence, you're standing on more interesting ground. Marshalling your own evidence. Here is where students feel the most panic, and honestly, it's misplaced. You already have more evidence than you think. You have read literature, you have studied history, you have lived a life, you have watched films, followed news stories, observed human behavior. All of that is fair game. The key move is connecting specific evidence to your thesis through substantive commentary. A common mistake students make is treating evidence as self-explanatory, dropping in an example and walking away from it, as if the grader will do the analytical work for you. They won't. Imagine you're showing a friend a photograph from your trip. Just holding it up and staying silent tells them almost nothing. You have to say, look at this. Notice how the light hits the ruins here, which is why this captures what I was telling you about. Commentary is your narrating voice. It explains what the evidence means, why it supports your claim, and what it reveals about the larger argument you're building. The scoring rubric distinguishes between responses that use evidence with adequate commentary and those with specific evidence and thorough commentary that consistently explains the line of reasoning. That higher tier is the difference between a 4 and a 5. Your evidence should feel specific. Not throughout history, leaders have made mistakes, but when Robert McNamara continued escalating troop deployments in Vietnam, despite mounting intelligence that the strategy wasn't working, he demonstrated precisely how institutional momentum can override rational judgment. Specificity signals credibility. Building a line of reasoning, one of the most under-discussed requirements in this essay is what the rubric calls a line of reasoning. This means your argument has a logical structure that the reader can follow, each body paragraph not just making a point, but building on the previous one so that the whole essay moves somewhere. Think of your essay less like a list of examples and more like a case being built in a courtroom. The first piece of evidence establishes the foundation. The second deepens or extends it. The third might address a complication or a counter-argument. Speaking of counter-arguments, addressing them is one of the most powerful moves available to you. A student who acknowledges the opposing view and then explains why their position still holds demonstrates exactly the kind of complex, nuanced thinking that earns the sophistication point. The sophistication point is notoriously hard to score, but one reliable path to it is demonstrating an understanding of the issue's genuine complexity rather than treating it as black and white. Common traps and how to avoid them. Several predictable mistakes cost students points on this essay. First, students write long, beautiful introductions that summarize the prompt's context without ever taking a clear stance. They don't commit to a thesis until the third paragraph, which burns time and muddles the argument. Take your position early and clearly. Second, students confuse quantity of examples with quality of analysis. 3 well-developed, deeply analyzed examples will outscore 7 examples with 2 sentences of commentary each. Go deep, not wide. Third, students neglect transitions between paragraphs, which causes their essays to feel like disconnected exhibits in a museum rather than a coherent, moving argument. Transitions are the moments where you remind the reader of your thesis and show how this new piece of evidence advances the overall case. Finally, watch your tone. This is a formal academic argument. Phrases like "in today's society since the dawn of time" or "everyone knows that" are cliches that signal vague thinking. Replace them with precision. Connecting to the bigger picture. This essay is the culmination of everything Unit 8 has been building toward. All the rhetorical appeals you studied, ethos, pathos, logos, now belong to you as a writer. The strategies for developing claims, the work on qualifications and concessions, the understanding of how audience shapes argument, all of it feeds directly into what you're producing on this page. And because you're writing without sources, your credibility comes entirely from how well you reason, not from citations, which means ethos here is about the quality of your thinking. As we move into the final review strategies for the exam, you'll want to practice timed argument essays regularly because fluency in this kind of thinking is a skill you build, not a talent you either have or don't. 8.13 Using personal experience, reading, and observation as evidence. Let's talk about something that, on the surface, sounds almost too simple to be a dedicated AP topic. Using what you already know, what you've read, and what you've seen as evidence in an argument. You might be thinking, don't I already do that? And the answer is yes, but probably not with the precision and intentionality that will earn you top marks on the AP exam. There's a significant difference between casually referencing your own life and strategically deploying personal experience as rhetorical evidence. That gap is exactly what this section is here to close. The 3 sources of evidence. Think of your evidence toolkit as having 3 distinct compartments. The first is personal experience, events from your own life, your emotional responses, your first-hand encounters with a topic. The second is reading, anything you've encountered in texts, from news articles and novels to historical documents and scientific studies. The third is observation, things you've witnessed happening around you, patterns you've noticed in the world, behaviors you've seen without necessarily experiencing yourself. College Board wants you to understand not just that these sources exist, but when and how each one is most rhetorically effective and what limitations each carries. Here's an analogy. Imagine you're a lawyer making a case. Personal experience is like taking the stand yourself. It's powerful, it's immediate, and it connects emotionally. But a good lawyer knows that the jury might wonder whether you're too close to the situation to be objective. Reading is like presenting documented evidence, court records, expert testimony, published research. It carries the weight of external authority and suggests you've done your homework. Observation is like calling a witness who watched events unfold firsthand but wasn't directly involved. There's credibility in that slight remove, that sense of being a careful watcher rather than a participant. Each type of evidence does different rhetorical work, and sophisticated writers know when to reach for which tool. Why evidence type matters for argument on the AP exam, especially in the argument essay, question 3 of the free response section. You'll be asked to develop an argument using evidence, reasoning, and commentary. The prompt almost always invites you to draw from your own experience, reading, or observation. But here's the trap that sinks so many students. They treat this as permission to write a casual personal essay. It isn't. You're writing an argument, and your personal experience, reading, or observation must function as evidence in service of a clear, defensible claim. The College Board's scoring rubric for the argument essay rewards you for the sophistication of your reasoning, meaning you need to show not just that something happened to you or that you read something, but that you understand the relationship between your evidence and your claim. This is where students lose point. They narrate an experience vividly but forget to explain why it proves the argument. The commentary, the analytical link between evidence and claim, is everything. Think of it this way. The evidence is the ingredient, but the reasoning is the recipe. A pile of flour, eggs, and sugar doesn't become a cake until someone applies a process to it. Your job as a writer is to be that process, explicitly connecting your chosen evidence to the larger point you're making. Personal experience, powerful but perilous. Personal experience is rhetorically potent because it activates emotional identification in the reader, what classical rhetoricians would call a pathos appeal. When you share a specific, concrete experience, you invite your reader into a human moment, which can make abstract arguments feel urgent and real. If you're arguing that standardized testing fails to capture student ability, opening with a specific moment from your own testing history, the anxiety, the disconnect between your grade and your knowledge, puts your reader inside the problem rather than outside looking at statistics. The limitation and the exam trap is that personal experience constitutes only anecdotal evidence. One instance does not prove a universal claim. Sophisticated writers acknowledge this implicitly by also deploying other forms of evidence or by framing their personal experience as an illustrative case rather than a definitive proof. If your argument relies entirely on "this happened to me, therefore it's true for everyone," the College Board's rubric will identify your reasoning as limited. You need to extend beyond the personal, even when you start there. Reading the evidence of authority. Evidence drawn from your reading carries the rhetorical weight of logos. It signals to your audience that your position is informed, research-backed, and not merely opinion. When you reference a text, whether it's a canonical literary work, a historical speech, a news article, or a scientific finding, you're borrowing credibility. You're saying, in effect, I'm not alone in this position. The intellectual record supports it. On the exam, you don't need to cite sources with formal footnotes. What you do need is to reference texts specifically enough that the connection is clear and credible. Vague gestures like "studies show" or "I once read something about this" don't earn credit. Instead, give enough detail, an author's name, a title, a specific finding or moment from the text, to demonstrate genuine engagement. This is also where your reading across other AP units pays dividends. The historical documents from synthesis prompts, the rhetorical texts from earlier units, the literary works from your broader education all become available evidence when you've engaged with them carefully. Observation, the credibility of the witness. Observation sits at an interesting midpoint. It isn't as intimate as personal experience, and it doesn't carry the institutional authority of published texts, but it has its own rhetorical virtue. It suggests careful attention to the world. Writers who deploy observation effectively position themselves as thoughtful witnesses, people who notice what others overlook. If you're arguing about the social effects of smartphone use, describing a specific scene you've repeatedly watched unfold, a table of friends each staring at separate screens, conversation absent carries real rhetorical force because it's concrete, visual, and suggests a pattern rather than a single incident. Connecting to the broader exam. This topic connects directly to Unit 7's work on appeals and rhetorical situation, because every evidence choice you make is also an appeal choice. Personal experience leans on pathos. Reading leans on logos and often ethos. Observation can activate either, depending on framing. It also connects to the synthesis essay, question 1, where you're combining external sources rather than your own experiences. Understanding the distinctions between evidence types helps you evaluate source credibility and integrate texts purposefully. The most common mistake students make is treating all three evidence types as interchangeable. They aren't. Match your evidence to your rhetorical purpose, anchor it to your claim with explicit reasoning, and acknowledge its limitations when appropriate, and you've done the sophisticated work the rubric rewards. As you move forward, we'll build on these evidence skills by examining how writers construct and evaluate the logical structure of arguments, including how to recognize when evidence supports a claim and when it only seems to. 8.1 for evaluating the quality and relevance of self-sourced evidence. Imagine you're building a case in front of a jury. You've done your homework, you've gathered your evidence, and you're ready to present. But here's the thing, not all evidence is created equal, and a sharp jury is going to notice if you hand them a crumpled napkin when you promise them a signed contract. That's exactly what this section is about. When you go out into the world and find your own evidence to support an argument, you take on a responsibility. You have to be able to look that evidence in the eye and honestly ask, are you actually good enough to do the job I need you to do? What self-sourced evidence actually means in the context of the AP language exam, self-sourced evidence refers to the evidence you independently locate, select, and integrate into your own argument. Most prominently in the free response question, known as the argument essay, but also in the synthesis essay when you bring in outside knowledge beyond the provided sources. You are the curator, the editor, and the advocate for this evidence all at once. College Board expects you to demonstrate that you haven't just grabbed the first statistic that confirmed your gut feeling. Instead, you've exercised critical judgment, and that critical judgment is exactly what's being scored. The two big questions, quality and relevance. Think of quality and relevance as the two lenses on a pair of glasses. If one lens is scratched, your whole view is distorted. Quality asks, is this evidence credible, accurate, and sufficiently detailed? Relevance asks, does this evidence actually connect to the claim I'm making? You need both lenses clean, because strong evidence that doesn't connect to your argument is useless. And perfectly relevant evidence from an unreliable source undermines your entire case. Quality breaks down into a few considerations you'll need to hold in your head simultaneously. First, consider the source's credibility. Who produced this information and why should we trust them? A peer-reviewed study from a team of epidemiologists at Johns Hopkins carries more weight than an anonymous blog post, not because blogs are always wrong, but because peer review is a mechanism of accountability. Second, consider recency. A study from 1987 on internet usage habits is not going to serve you well in an argument about social media's effects on teenagers today. Third, consider specificity. Vague generalizations many studies show without naming one are a red flag for both exam scorers and real-world readers. Precise, concrete evidence demonstrates that you've actually engaged with the material rather than waving your hand at it. Relevance is where students lose the most points without even realizing it. Here's a trap that shows up constantly. You make a claim about one thing, and then you offer evidence about something adjacent but not identical. Say you're arguing that smartphone use harms adolescent mental health. You find a compelling statistic showing that screen time has increased dramatically over the past decade. That's a quality piece of evidence, but is it relevant? It tells us about screen time broadly. It doesn't directly address mental health outcomes. You haven't yet connected the dots. The evidence becomes relevant only when you explain the logical bridge between the data point and your claim. On the AP exam, simply dropping evidence into your essay and moving on is never enough. The commentary, the analysis that explains why this evidence proves your point, is where the relevance is established and where your score climbs. The CRAP test and how to adapt it. You may have encountered the CRAP test in your research classes: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. It's a useful checklist, but for AP Lang purposes, you want to internalize it as a set of questions rather than a rigid formula, because the exam is testing your thinking, not your ability to recite an acronym. Ask yourself, when was this produced? Does the producer have genuine expertise or a stake in misleading me? Does the information hold up against other sources I know? And critically, what is the purpose of this source? A tobacco company-funded study on the health effects of smoking has an obvious conflict of interest that compromises its authority, even if the methodology looks clean on the surface. Recognizing purpose and potential bias is a hallmark of a sophisticated rhetorical reader, which is exactly who College Board wants to see when they score your exam. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. The most dangerous trap on the multiple-choice questions related to this concept is the plausible but imprecise option. You'll be given a passage where a writer uses evidence, and you'll be asked to evaluate how well it supports the argument. One answer choice will describe the evidence as relevant and sufficient, and another will say it partially supports but requires additional context. Students who read too quickly grab the first option because the evidence sounds related to the topic, but College Board loves to reward students who notice the gap between what the evidence literally says and what the argument actually needs. Slow down. Trace the logical chain from evidence to claim, and ask whether any links are missing. On the free response argument essay, a common error is using anecdotal evidence as if it carries the weight of empirical data. A personal story can be a powerful rhetorical tool. It builds pathos and makes abstract issues human. But if your entire argument rests on one person's experience, a scorer trained in College Board's rubric will note that your evidence base is narrow, and your reasoning hasn't accounted for counterexamples. The strongest essays blend evidence types: statistical or empirical evidence for logos, personal or narrative evidence for pathos, and expert testimony for ethos. That combination signals to the scorer that you understand the full landscape of what evidence can do. Connections to other units. This skill doesn't live in a silo. It connects directly to Unit 4's work on rhetorical appeals. When you evaluate evidence quality, you're really asking which appeal it activates and whether that appeal is appropriate for the context. It connects to Unit 6's analysis of authors' choices, because understanding why a writer selected certain evidence over other available evidence is a form of rhetorical analysis. And it connects to the synthesis essay skills from Unit 7, where you're evaluating provided sources for the same qualities you demand of your own: credibility, accuracy, relevance, and purpose. The student who can evaluate evidence in a source they didn't choose is practicing the same muscle as the student who evaluates evidence they found themselves. The only difference is that when you self-source, there's no safety net, you made the call, and you own it. A final thought before we move on. Here's the honest truth about why this skill matters beyond the exam. The world is absolutely drowning in information, and most of it is trying to sell you something. The habit of asking, "Is this good evidence for this specific claim?" is one of the most valuable intellectual tools you can develop, and the AP Lang exam is, in a sense, checking whether you've started building that habit. Once you've gotten comfortable evaluating the quality and relevance of your own evidence, you're ready to zoom out and look at how evidence functions within larger argumentative structures, which is exactly where we're headed next. 8.15 Sustaining an argument across an extended essay. Let's talk about what separates a good essay from a great one, and more importantly, what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5 on your AP Lang free response section. You can have a brilliant thesis, killer evidence, and sharp analysis in your opening paragraphs and still fall apart by the end. The skill College Board is testing in this concept is called sustaining an argument, and it's exactly what it sounds like: keeping your argument coherent, focused, and purposeful from your first sentence to your last. Think of it like running a marathon. Sprinting the first mile doesn't win you anything if you collapse at mile 22. What sustaining actually means. When College Board talks about sustaining an argument, they're asking whether your essay functions as a unified whole. Every paragraph, every piece of evidence, every rhetorical move you make should feel like it belongs to the same conversation you started in your introduction. The AP exam rewards what the scoring rubric calls sophistication and coherence, two words that are easy to say and harder to execute. Coherence means your argument doesn't drift. Sophistication means your argument doesn't stay in the shallow end, Together, they require you to keep your thesis alive and evolving throughout the entire essay, not just announce it once and abandon it. Here's an analogy that might help. Imagine you're building a suspension bridge. Your thesis is the central cable. Every support beam, every road panel, every anchor point needs to connect back to that cable, or the whole structure collapses. Students who lose points on sustainability are the ones who build beautiful individual panels, great paragraphs in isolation, but forget to hook them back to the main cable. The bridge looks like a bridge from a distance, but doesn't actually hold together. The role of the thesis in extended argumentation. Your thesis isn't just a sentence you write in the introduction and move on from on AP Lang essays. Whether you're writing an argument essay, a synthesis essay, or a rhetorical analysis, your thesis is a claim you must defend repeatedly and progressively. College Board's rubric explicitly rewards essays that demonstrate a complex understanding of the topic, and that complexity has to emerge across the essay, not just appear in one clever sentence. This means your body paragraphs should each be doing one of three things: developing your thesis by adding new evidence or reasoning, complicating your thesis by acknowledging nuance or counter-argument, or extending your thesis by connecting your claim to broader implications. When you do all three across your essay, you're sustaining. When you only do the first, just adding more examples that say the same thing, you're stacking, not building, and the rubric will reflect that. Transitions as argumentative tools. One of the most commonly missed points on the AP Lang rubric involves transitions, and not just the mechanical furthermore and in addition variety. True argumentative transitions do more than signal a new paragraph is starting. They remind your reader of the logical relationship between what you just argued and what you're about to argue. Think of transitions as the connective tissue of your essay. Without them, your paragraphs are organs just floating around, functional in isolation, useless without connection. Strong, sustained arguments use what you might call retrospective-prospective transitions, a sentence that briefly looks back at the previous point while looking forward to the next one. Something like, while this evidence establishes that fear-based rhetoric creates urgency, it doesn't yet explain why audiences accept it so readily, and that's exactly what the author's appeal to shared identity accomplishes. That one sentence does three things simultaneously. It validates the prior paragraph, it creates intellectual momentum, and it signals that your argument is developing, not just repeating itself. Handling counter-argument without losing the thread. Here's a trap that catches even strong writers. When you introduce a counter-argument, which you absolutely should do to earn sophistication points, you run the risk of making the counter-argument sound more convincing than your own claim. This happens when students spend 2 sentences on their position and 4 sentences fairly representing the opposing view, then end the paragraph without a clear rebuttal or concession and pivot. The result is an essay that feels like it's arguing against itself. Your reader loses the thread of your original claim. The fix is what rhetoricians call a strategic concession. You acknowledge the merit of the opposing view in a way that actually strengthens your position. Language like, although critics argue X, and there is merit to that concern, this reasoning ultimately underestimates Y keeps you in control of the argument. You're not ignoring complexity, you're demonstrating that your thesis can absorb complexity without breaking. That's sophistication, that's what earns the top row of the rubric. Conclusions that argue, not just summarize. The single most common place students abandon their argument is the conclusion. After working through 3 or 4 body paragraphs of genuine analysis, they default to restating the introduction in slightly different words. This is the argumentation equivalent of a marathon runner slowing to a walk 50 yards from the finish line. A sustained argument ends with forward momentum. Your conclusion should answer the implicit question your reader has been forming throughout the essay. So what? What are the broader implications of your claim? What does this argument reveal about human nature, society, rhetoric, or the issue at hand that extends beyond the specific text or prompt? College Board's rubric language here is precise. They want you to place your argument within a broader context. That phrase is your guide. Your conclusion should zoom out, not repeat. Connect your local argument to a wider conversation. Connections across the AP course. This skill doesn't live in isolation. Sustaining an argument is the umbrella skill that organizes everything else you've studied in AP Lang. Your understanding of thesis development from earlier units provides the anchor. Your work on evidence and commentary ensures each paragraph earns its place. Your rhetorical analysis skills help you make stylistic choices that reinforce rather than undermine your argument's momentum. On the synthesis essay, sustaining an argument means ensuring your sources serve your thesis rather than driving it, a common reversal students fall into. On the rhetorical analysis essay, it means keeping your analytical claim about the author's purpose as the spine of every paragraph, rather than drifting into mere summary. When you walk into the exam, remember, the reader is evaluating your essay not paragraph by paragraph, but as a complete argument. They want to feel at the end of your last sentence that you knew exactly where you were going from the very beginning, and that every step of the journey was deliberate. As we move forward, we'll look at how these argumentation skills connect to refining your overall writing style and voice, because how you say something is inseparable from how well you sustain what you're saying. 8.16 Anticipating and Addressing Counterarguments. What is a counterargument, and why should you care? Imagine you're trying to convince a skeptical friend to adopt a rescue dog. You make your case dogs are loyal, loving, great for mental health, and then your friend crosses their arms and says, "But what about the cost, the time commitment, my landlord?" Now here's the question. Do you pretend those objections don't exist, or do you tackle them head on? If you want to actually persuade your friend, you tackle them. That's exactly what a skilled arguer does on the AP exam, in your FRQ essays, and in any serious piece of writing you'll ever produce. Anticipating and addressing counterarguments isn't a sign of weakness in your argument, it's a sign of intellectual confidence and rhetorical maturity. The College Board uses very specific language here, so let's lock it in. A counterargument is any claim, perspective, or piece of evidence that challenges or complicates your central argument. When you anticipate a counterargument, you bring it up yourself before your opponent does. You're essentially saying, "I know what you're thinking, and here's why I've already considered it." When you address it, you respond to that challenge in a way that ultimately strengthens your position. Together, these moves are sometimes called concession and refutation, and understanding the difference between those two sub-moves is critical for the exam. Concession versus refutation, don't confuse them. This is one of the most commonly tested distinctions on both the multiple choice and free response sections, so pay close attention. A concession is when you acknowledge that the counterargument has some merit. You're admitting the opposing view has a point, partially at least. A refutation, sometimes called a rebuttal, is when you argue back against the counterargument, explaining why it doesn't ultimately undermine your thesis. Strong academic arguments almost always use both moves together. Think of it like a courtroom drama. A brilliant defense attorney doesn't just pretend the prosecution's evidence doesn't exist. She says, "Yes, my client was at the scene, we acknowledge that. But here's why that evidence still doesn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That yes, but structure is the heartbeat of effective counterargument handling." You'll see transitional language like, "while it is true that, admittedly, although, granted," or one might argue signaling a concession. Then you'll see a pivot, "however, nevertheless." Yet, even so, this does not mean signaling the refutation. On the AP exam, you need to be able to identify these moves in someone else's prose during the multiple choice section and execute them yourself in the argumentative FRQ. The straw man trap, a critical edge case. Here's where many students and many writers go wrong. When you address a counter-argument, you must represent it fairly and accurately. If you misrepresent the opposing view by making it weaker or more extreme than it actually is, you've committed what rhetoricians call a straw man fallacy. You're not actually defeating the real argument, you're defeating a flimsy version you constructed yourself. The College Board will test your ability to recognize this in MCQ passages, and AP readers will penalize argumentative essays that dismiss counterarguments too easily or unfairly. A response that says, "Some people foolishly believe that renewable energy is perfect and has no drawbacks whatsoever," is distorting the actual position of renewable energy advocates, who almost universally acknowledge real challenges. Your counter-argument handling must be steel-manned, not straw-manned. Engage with the strongest version of the opposing view. Why? This move works rhetorically. From an AP rhetorical analysis perspective, addressing counter-arguments connects directly to the classical appeals you studied in earlier units. When you acknowledge an opposing view charitably, you build ethos. You come across as reasonable, well-informed, and trustworthy rather than one-sided and defensive. You're showing the audience that you've done your homework, that you've considered multiple angles, that you're not just a zealot shouting your position. This is deeply connected to Unit 5 and Unit 6 concepts around audience awareness and the rhetorical situation. Strong arguers always write with an implied skeptic in mind. They're constantly asking, what would someone who disagrees with me say right now, and how do I earn their trust while still winning them over? There's also a logos dimension here. When you raise and then refute a counter-argument, you're essentially removing an obstacle from your reader's mental path. Before you addressed it, that objection might have been lurking in the reader's mind, quietly eroding their confidence in your thesis. By dealing with it directly, you've cleared the road. The argument flows more smoothly and feels more airtight because you've done the intellectual heavy lifting of testing your own position. Placement and structural choices on the FRQ. Where you place your counter-argument matters. You can address an opposing view at the beginning of your essay, a move that immediately establishes your credibility and signals intellectual honesty before launching into your main evidence. You can address it in the middle, typically after you've established your strongest points, which prevents the counter-argument from getting too much early airtime. Or you can address it near the end, just before your conclusion as a final act of reinforcing how solid your thesis is even under scrutiny. All three placements can earn rubric credit, but the College Board's scoring guidelines specifically reward essays that address complexity and nuance, and counter-argument is one of the clearest ways to demonstrate both. A response that ignores the other side entirely will almost never score in the highest tier for sophistication. Common MCQ traps to avoid. In the multiple-choice section, you'll encounter questions asking you to identify what a particular paragraph or sentence does in a passage's argument. A very common trap is confusing a concession with the author's own thesis statement. Remember, a concession is the author giving some ground to the opposition. It will often feel slightly uncomfortable, like the author is weakening their own case. That discomfort is intentional. The signal is in those transitional pivot words that follow, where the author reasserts their position with renewed force. Another trap is identifying a refutation as a mere qualification. A qualification hedges or limits a claim. This is true in most cases. A refutation actively pushes back against an opposing argument. Read the context carefully. What position is being addressed, and whose voice does this sentence reflect? Connecting to the bigger picture. This skill threads through nearly every unit in AP Lang. In Unit 7, you analyzed how real-world authors handle complexity in their arguments. That's counter-argument in action. In your synthesis FRQ, you'll need to acknowledge that your sources don't all agree and that reasonable people interpret evidence differently. That, too, is a form of counter-argument management. Even in rhetorical analysis, identifying where an author preempts objections is a sophisticated observation that can elevate your analysis into high-scoring territory. The ability to hold two competing ideas in your mind simultaneously to say, I see why you think that, and here's why I still disagree, is one of the most mature intellectual skills you can demonstrate on this exam. Master it, and you're not just a better test taker. You're a more persuasive thinker in every corner of your academic and professional life. Up next, we'll look at how the language of qualification and hedging helps writers fine-tune their claims, and why knowing when not to overstate your argument is just as powerful as knowing when to press forward with confidence. 8.17 Argument Scoring, Understanding the AP Argument, FRQ Rubric. Let's talk about something that can genuinely change your score on exam day. Understanding exactly how the AP graders are evaluating your argument FRQ before you write a single word. Imagine you're a chef competing in a cooking competition. You could make the most creative, elaborate dish imaginable, but if the judges are scoring on texture, presentation, and balance, and you have no idea, you might pour all your energy into the wrong things. Knowing the rubric is like reading the judge's scorecard in advance. It doesn't limit your creativity. It channels it toward what actually earns points. The big picture, how the argument FRQ is scored. The AP argument FRQ is worth up to 6 points, and those points are distributed across 3 distinct scoring categories. The thesis, 1 point, the evidence and commentary up to 4 points, and the sophistication, 1 point. That's it. 3 categories, 6 points. But here's where students get tripped up. They assume each category rewards the same kind of effort. They don't. Understanding the weight and the criteria for each is the foundation of everything else we're about to discuss. Think of it like a 3-legged stool. You need all 3 legs to sit comfortably, but some legs carry more load than others. Your evidence and commentary category is the heavy lifter here. 4 of your 6 points live there. That means the bulk of your writing energy, your analytical muscle, your best thinking, it all needs to show up in how you develop and discuss your evidence. A killer thesis and a flashy, sophisticated move won't save you if your body paragraphs are thin. The thesis point, earning it and protecting it. To earn the thesis point, your thesis must do one specific thing. Make a defensible claim that responds to the prompt and establishes a line of reasoning. Notice that College Board uses the phrase, line of reasoning. This is AP-specific language you need to internalize. A defensible claim is not a restatement of the prompt, it's not a question, and it's not a fact that no reasonable person would dispute. It's a position that could be argued against, a genuine stake in the ground. The common trap here is writing a thesis that merely acknowledges complexity without actually taking a position. Students write something like, there are many perspectives on this issue and each has merit. That's an observation, not an argument. A stronger version might be, while economic pressures complicate the picture, individual responsibility remains the most powerful force for social change. That's a claim someone could push back on, which means it's defensible. Here's another trap, putting your thesis at the very end of your essay. The rubric doesn't require it to be in the introduction, technically, but in practice, a thesis buried in your conclusion is disconnected from the reasoning you've built, and it's often too late to establish a line of reasoning that runs through the whole essay. Put it early, usually at the end of your introduction, where it can do the structural work it's supposed to do. Evidence and commentary. Where essays win and lose, this 4-point tier is where the real differentiation happens, and it operates on a scale. At the lowest level, 0 to 1 points, an essay either doesn't use evidence at all or presents evidence without explaining it. At the 2-point level, you're providing specific evidence and some commentary, but the commentary doesn't quite connect back to your thesis. At the 3-point level, your evidence is specific. Your commentary explains how it supports your argument, and you're doing this consistently across the essay. To hit the 4-point ceiling, you need to do all of that while also explaining the line of reasoning, meaning your paragraphs aren't just individually sound, they're logically sequenced and build on each other to advance an overall argument. Here's an analogy that helps. Think of your essay like a legal case. Evidence is the exhibit you hold up in court. Commentary is your lawyer explaining what the exhibit proves. Line of reasoning is the entire narrative strategy that connects every exhibit to the verdict you're arguing for. A lawyer who holds up a bloody glove without explanation loses the jury. A lawyer who holds up the glove explains what it proves and shows how it fits the larger pattern of guilt. That's the 4-point essay. Students commonly confuse specific evidence with a lot of evidence. You could cite 5 sources shallowly and earn fewer points than a student who uses 2 sources with deep, connected analysis. Quality of commentary outweighs quantity of examples almost every time. The sophistication point, the most misunderstood point on the rubric. This single point is the most misunderstood element of the entire FRQ. Students think sophistication means using big vocabulary words or sounding fancy. It doesn't. College Board defines sophistication as demonstrating a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. There are a few specific ways to earn it, and you essentially need to do one of them consistently and skillfully, not just gesture at it once. Those pathways include explaining the significance or implications of your argument beyond the immediate context, explaining and genuinely engaging with a counter-argument rather than dismissing it, connecting your argument to a broader concept or issue, or explaining the limitations of your own argument. The key word in all of these is explaining. Mentioning that a counter-argument exists is not sophistication. Walking through the counter-argument and then showing why your position is still more compelling and doing it with nuance, that's sophistication. The critical boundary condition here: sophistication cannot be earned by a single impressive sentence dropped into an otherwise shallow essay. Graders are looking for evidence that a complex understanding pervades the essay. This is why it's worth 1 point and why it comes last. It's a capstone, not a shortcut. Connections to the rest of the course. This rubric doesn't exist in isolation. Everything you've studied in earlier units, rhetorical analysis, claims and evidence from Unit 4, line of reasoning from Unit 7, all feeds directly into how you earn these points. When you practiced identifying how an author builds an argument in Unit 6, you were learning the moves that your own argument FRQ needs to replicate. The vocabulary of rhetoric, ethos, logos, pathos, appeals, evidence types gives you the analytical language that elevates commentary from summary into genuine analysis. Understanding this rubric also reshapes how you read the argument prompt itself. The prompt always contains context, a claim or topic, and a task, and recognizing the rhetorical situation embedded in the prompt is exactly what helps you position a defensible thesis and select the evidence that serves your line of reasoning most powerfully. Now that you understand how your argument is scored, let's look at the strategies for actually building that argument from the ground up, starting with how to read the prompt and construct a thesis under timed conditions.